Hello. Thanks so much for being here. I'm going to get your attention back together for the next very fun part of our day. Again, I want to say another congratulations to our honoree Michael Sachs. Abraham Lincoln once said, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And man, does Michael Sachs do good with his power. Thank you, Michael, for talking about Israel and for pensions. Who does that? Who talks about pensions with what they can do? Thank you. I'm Heather Staines. I'm one of the co-chairs today and a proud member of the BGA board. I'm very proud to have joined BGA soon after I left the state Senate. I saw the good they were doing to try to create a more just, open, and equitable government in the state, and I'm very fond of their work. It's my pleasure to introduce the highlight of today's luncheon now, David Greising's conversation with two Chicago authors, Natalie Moore and Jonathan Eig. Natalie Moore is an award-winning journalist and author, currently serving as WBEZ's Race, Class, and Communities editor, and she wrote the book The South Side, really highlighting segregation here in the city of Chicago. She's also she joined the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government as a senior practitioner fellow. And Jonathan Eig has written he's an award-winning journalist, written 6 books, Birth of the Pill, Ali, A Life, for which he won the PEN American Liberty Award and was a Mark Linton History Prize finalist. His new book, King a Life, is a bestseller that has won universal accolades for its revelatory insights into the civil rights icon. And really on a more personal note, and probably means a lot more to these authors, each of my book clubs has read one of their books, and they both loved them. Thank you. Fabulous authors, come on up. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you, Heather, for that great introduction, and thank you, John and Natalie, for joining us today. Looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for the great books you've written as well. Spent a lot of great, enjoyable hours reading your work. Before, we'd like to focus this conversation on Martin Luther King's Chicago period, the work he did here in Chicago, as well as the legacy that King and the civil rights movement have left us with, and the city that we're dealing with today. But before getting to that, I feel obligated to ask John a question about one of his books, Get Capone. It's fitting, I think, in our 100th anniversary to look back to 1923 and the founding of the BGA, and I just thought, just spend a minute, John, why was the BGA necessary? Tell us about what was going on in Chicago with Big Bill Thompson and the Capone mob, et cetera.
Well, thanks, and it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. I think Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if you look at what was happening in 1923, it's not just a rhyme, it's like a very heavy-handed rhyme. We had City Hall corruption. We had a demoralized police department with rampant police misconduct. We had too many guns on the street, and we had a sense that all of this was bad for business and that something needed to be done about it, and the institutions, the government institutions, couldn't be trusted. So you started to see private citizens taking matters in their own hands. What can we do? The very notion that we called Al Capone public enemy number 1 was something that government leaders didn't come up with, police didn't come up with, the FBI didn't come up with. It was local businessmen who said we need to create a marketing campaign to try to disrupt the gangsters, the outlaws that are ruining our city's reputation. So you see things like the BGA coming in response to what city and other government officials weren't able to get done. Well,
great. And it's interesting that, as you say, with the Twain quote, that it rhymes because some of the same issues that you're talking about, it's perhaps the police corruption is not as big an issue today, but other police failings are an issue. Guns clearly are an issue, public corruption an issue. So yeah, I guess it does rhyme.
Yeah, and I think we'll see that it rhymes when we talk about the 60s and today as well, and look forward to getting into that with all three of
Great,
us here.
great. Well, let's jump into it. And I just want to start by asking each one of you, and I'll start with you, Natalie. Why'd you write The South Side? What did you want to say in writing that book?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I joke that that book is my dissertation for working at WBEZ at about 10 years at that point. But when I was covering issues around economic development, housing, violence, food injustice, all roads were leading back to segregation. That was the common denominator. But for a long time in the city, people accepted it as air and water. This is just how it is, without any interrogation of how it came to be or dismantling it. And so I thought that the conversation outside of academia needed to be shifted. And I wanted scholars to say she has great footnotes, she knows the history, but I also wanted it to be contemporary and get readers to understand how policies of the past shape how we are today, and as well as the current policies that still perpetuate segregation.
That's great. And King, it's gutsy to take on a civil rights icon. I guess you took on Muhammad Ali, you took on Lou Gehrig, so you have some guts as an author. Tell us about writing about King.
Guts and stupidity is a fine line. But, you know, it's actually not gutsy when you think about the fact that we need new biographies of people like King every generation at least, and there hadn't been one in 35, 40 years. 1982 was the last King biography, and if you look at what's happening, you look at what Natalie was just referring to, the segregation of the city, the patterns that King came here attempting to fight, you know, segregated housing, segregated schools, unequal job opportunities. He came here in 1966 to fight those very same issues, and we are still racked by those same issues. So you need a new biography. And one of the things that's happened in the case of King is that we've turned him into this national monument, that we've turned him into a national holiday, and we've lost sight of his humanity, and we've also watered down how radical his message was. When he came here to Chicago in '66, he presented realistic plans for how we could change the city, but they were radical, so radical in fact that he was, you know, run out of town essentially by the city power brokers, and we need to remember just how radical King's call was for justice, because the call has not been answered.
Right, and it's fitting that as you talk about, your objective is kind of humanizing him. Chicago is that inflection point after the first period of all of the heroic work he did in the civil rights movement, you know, beginning with Montgomery and going through Selma. Chicago was, as you pointed out, he was sort of, I don't know if he was run out of town, but he was possibly, you could say he was outmaneuvered by Richard J. Daley. So why did he pick Chicago at the time he did? What was driving him in making that particular choice?
Well, another one of the myths about King is that we say that he became more radical late in life, that he began to come closer to people like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, but I don't think that's true. I think he was pretty radical all along, but by the late 60s, he felt like he had a responsibility to speak out on issues of northern racism, northern segregation, police brutality, reparations, things that he actually talked about in the March on Washington speech, I Have a Dream, but we forget because we were so captivated by his dream that we don't read the first half of that speech. But he came to Chicago to prove that what he'd been saying all along was important to him, and that he was a hypocrite if he's, as his advisors were, he would be a hypocrite if he followed the advice of his advisors and stuck to where he was most effective, which was the South, which was voting rights. He felt like it was giving too many people a pass, and that he needed to call attention to what was going on elsewhere. And Chicago was what he chose to be, what he hoped would be a lightning rod.
So Natalie, your family moved up to Chicago. Your grandparents is part of the Great Migration. Your grandfather, I think, was a Pullman porter. Your dad worked in middle management. Your mother was a teacher. What was the Chicago that they were living in like in their lived experience during that time?
My mother grew up across the alley from Emmett Till. My father attended the funeral. My mother had nightmares from it as a kid, looking in Jet magazine. My grandparents lived in West Woodlawn, a neighborhood they were only able to live in because of Lorraine Hansberry's family. Carl Hansberry bought a home there in 1940, but it had a restrictive covenant. He accidentally got in. The case went to the Supreme Court, but they won on a technicality. But Mrs. Hansberry had to walk around the property with a shotgun, and a brick went through the home as well, which is on 61st and Rhodes. But what happened is that 500 homes opened up in the 1940s. So my grandfather was in World War II, the only one of his siblings who came from Georgia, and he came because my grandmother was here. It was either Chicago or Harlem, and the choice was easy. And my mother...
Always is.
Yeah.
Chicago or Harlem every time.
They're from the same small town, and she had come up here with her cousin, who she grew up with like a sister. So, these are the same patterns of migration, family following family. And then my mother went to school on a half-day schedule because Benjamin Willis, CEO or superintendent of the schools, didn't want to integrate schools. So for a year or two, so there were the trailers, the Willis wagons, as they're known, but yeah, she could only go to school for a half day. My father dealt with overcrowding and wasn't able to go to Gillespie, which is still there on 93rd and State Street. He went to Fenger High School. He integrated Fenger, and sidebar, my family lived in Pullman for, like my married family, for a little over a year, quite the Chicago adventure. We lived there because we were rehabbing a house, and to downsize, we rented this furnished row house. And my dad turned up his nose, and I was like, what's wrong with Pullman? And his memories were of being chased home from school, from Fenger. Like, he graduated early because he couldn't take the racism there. And he was like, yeah, the white boys from Pullman used to chase me. So that's just, I could go on and on, but that's just a snapshot of their lives.
You mentioning white boys in a gang-like activity like that, and it brings to mind, Richard J. Daley, as you point out in your book, was part of the Hamburg Club, and which was as you call it, a white gang, and was involved in one of the most horrific race episodes in Chicago, the 1919 race riot in which people were killed. I'm wondering, just to either one of you, when we think about some of the racists that King dealt with, whether that's Jim Clark or Bull Connor, how did Richard J. Daley, do you see his behavior or his personhood as being racist, or was it something other than that?
Well, yeah, he was racist. But you can be racist in a way that's not Bull Connor. It's the Jim Crow of the North. And he absolutely outmaneuvered King. He said, oh, there's no segregation here. And the way that he built and coalesced power through, controlling the congressional districts. I set out in one of my chapters was, why don't we talk about integration in Chicago public schools? And then when I finished the reporting, I realized the question was, why did integration fail in Chicago public schools? And it was because of him. And there have been moments through history, going back to the 1919 riots, there was that big report that came out in 1922 that said, like, it's 800 pages, but one of the key notes was, don't segregate housing. And that's exactly what happened. Alder people at the time were trying to create racial zones like apartheid. The Supreme Court didn't allow that to happen. There was a case out of Baltimore that struck that down, but they found other ways to maneuver. So, even though I'm a proud descendant of the Great Migration, I realized, like, my family and like other black families, they were able to do so much with so little, being faced with all this opposition to desegregate housing and public education.
And I would just add to that, I wouldn't put Daley in the same category as Bull Connor or Jim Clark. I would put him in the same category as J. Edgar Hoover. Because these are men who recognized, and by the way, you can go home from our lunch today and listen to the conversations between Daley and LBJ talking about the threat that MLK posed and why they both viewed him as an enemy. Because these men all were interested in holding on to power. That's what they were, that was in their DNA. As politicians, that's just their lifeblood. And J. Edgar Hoover was not necessarily a politician, but he was certainly a political animal. And he understood that King, in his ability to unite forces, in his ability to rally not just black crowds, but white supporters as well, posed a threat to the status quo, to the white supremacist government system that was working very well for the people in power. So King and Daley both recognized the threat in what happens if you let go of that power that you've been so successfully building for so long.
Well, John, let's talk from a BGA perspective, an open records angle on that. You said we can go home and listen to these tapes. Some of the most revelatory parts of your book come from various tapes, a lot of them from the FBI's legal but immoral, in some respects, taping of pretty much everything King did, with the approval of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, I might add. So tell us, like, what were some of the biggest revelations that you found? You've mentioned the Chicago stuff. What else do you think is most important that's been found in those tapes?
Well, we've known for a long time that the FBI was listening to King's phone calls, bugging his home, his office, some of his closest advisors, and planting listening devices in his hotel rooms. And the fact that King was having affairs with women other than his wife is not news. What's important about this is we've begun to realize, and there are more documents coming out all the time. President Trump accidentally actually released thousands of new transcripts of files. Thank you, sir. And I was able to find thousands of more documents. It turns out that LBJ was keeping a lot of the most sensitive correspondence from J. Edgar Hoover in his personal safe, and that they were filed in his secretary's archives. And I think I'm the first one to get those declassified. And what they show, and this is what's most important, is obviously King's sex life was not a threat to the government, or was not posed no threat to national security. It became a tool for them to try to destroy him, to try to break up the civil rights movement, to try to put down any political efforts that the black community was making to achieve justice. And they used that, King's personal life, in an attempt to destroy him. The big revelation for me is that we too often blame J. Edgar Hoover and put all of it on his shoulder. He deserves plenty of the blame, but the news media was aware of this and didn't report on it. Members of Congress were aware of it and didn't report on it. President Johnson was actually encouraging the FBI to leak this material on King to the press. They were all complicit, and we need to understand, and this is the kind of work that the BGA does so well, we need to hold people accountable and not take the easy solution and to say J. Edgar Hoover was a racist. He was a racist, and there's a lot more to the story.
Right. Let's go back to the Daley legacy and the situation in which King was operating here in Chicago. One of his interesting decisions to me was his choice of a walk-up apartment in North Lawndale. He could have chosen a housing project. The 4 or 5 years before he came to Chicago, I think it was the Robert Taylor homes were started in '62. What do you make of that choice, knowing what happened to the housing projects, Natalie, compared to picking a community like North Lawndale?
So on one hand, the placement of public housing was strategic and racist. And because, Chicago has so many alder people, you can say this isn't, the white aldermen could say, we don't want this housing in our ward. And it was easy for the city to build it. But in the 1960s, Stateway Gardens and Robert Taylor represented promise and hope. So it was slum clearance of the kitchenettes and then ended up being another slum replacement, but shiny new buildings with elevators, and you had families living there at the time, two-parent homes with incomes, and that's not to say that single moms can't raise children, but by the 1970s, they started housing the poorest of the poor. And by that point, you were getting less rent. There were policies that did not incentivize marriage and two-person incomes. And so you had poverty on top of poverty. So by the time King came here, yes, they shouldn't have been built in those areas, but it didn't represent the slum housing that we came to know by the 1970s and 80s. But one lasting legacy of King being here is fair housing testing. So a lot of fair housing organizations do testing. They'll, get me and, a spouse and then maybe a white couple to try to buy a home or rent, and then you see what happens. Well, that first happened in Chicago. So King noticed that people were calling for housing, and I was able to find audio of this, where he was like, suddenly the housing isn't available. And there's still fair housing testing to this day. And there's still discrimination. People are still saying no Section 8 or no disabilities, no, pick whatever protected class you want. But it was, I never knew that started from King being here in Chicago.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to add to that, King's focus really at that point and throughout much of the latter half of the 60s was on economics. And that's why he wasn't interested in going to these, as you said, these fairly new public housing developments, which were still full of hope or promised some hope. But he wanted to point out the economic inequalities in Chicago. He wanted to point out the housing inequalities. The apartment he rented in North Lawndale cost more than an equally sized apartment would have cost in, say, Lincoln Park at that time, because these landlords were gouging their tenants, and the conditions were abominable. And he had a fairly elaborate plan for how they were going to pressure landlords to step up their game and to be more fair. He was also here to talk about job opportunities and integrating schools. So it was a comprehensive plan to look at some of the fundamental issues. And I think he felt like being in North Lawndale was a better way to approach some of the comprehensive issues and not just focus on housing.
Yeah, and Chicago's uniquely segregated neighborhoods, which there's racial bias behind that. We tend to look at this in large measure as a government down issue, yet we also see in the history of Chicago housing with blockbusting and other private market transactions, the way that neighborhoods, white flight that happened was sort of engineered by realtors. Tell people a little bit about the blockbusting and some of these other attributes of the housing market, Natalie.
So the Supreme Court said that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable by 1948. It wasn't until 1960 with the Fair Housing Act that they were really illegal. But they weren't enforced. The court said they could not be enforceable, and so you started to see white flight. And I always say that the white flight didn't mean that families started pitching tents in the open prairie. They had a place to go. The government subsidized the interstate highway. The government subsidized single-family homes in the suburbs, so they had some place to go. So then you get African-American families, and you see over a 10-year period, neighborhoods go from 99% white to 99% black. And one of the things that happened during that time is realtors would go to these blocks and tell white families the blacks are coming. And they would get them to sell their house, and then they would sell it to a black family at a bad rate as well.
Well, on a contract that actually didn't enable them to have ownership of the house.
Well, and that's a separate issue. So then the contract buying black families, particularly in Inglewood, Tanika Johnson has been mapping these. She actually put a sign in front of a house in Inglewood, and the owner took it down. Public art saying that this is stolen land, this is theft. And so you had families who thought they were owning the home, but they didn't have the deed, and one missed payment could mean that you were evicted. So UIC and Duke did a study looking at how much wealth was plundered, and conservatively, it was in the billions.
So this was going on at this time, and King, after his experience in Chicago, said this is after, I guess, the epic march at Marquette Park, right, where he was hit by a brick or a stone. He said this was the worst racism he saw anywhere in the country. Tell us about that.
Well, I think you can understand, given what Natalie just described, why there was so much tension there. Why, when he announces that he's going to lead a march from Marquette Park, you've got these white people who are so angry that they are, overturning cars, that they are throwing bricks at Martin Luther King. And King did, when he left, said that the people of Chicago could teach the people of Birmingham and Selma something about racism. And it's because of these economic conditions that Natalie was just describing. There was this sense of fear that they were going to be replaced, to use a word that we hear echoed again today in the rhymes of history.
Yeah, and you mentioned, John, earlier that sort of this period that he's looking more broadly, or he's getting more attention for his broader focus. Because as you say, in the '63 I Have a Dream speech, he brought up some of these issues. But he's going to the Poor People's Campaign now, and he's really becoming outspoken on Vietnam. And was that, in terms of his impact on civil rights in cities like Chicago, was that the right call for him, or should he have stayed in his lane in order to continued the work on civil rights that he had done?
It's really important that we remember that King was disliked in America. The vast majority of Americans in public opinion polls said he was mistaken, that he was out of his lane, as you said, and he had gone from being one of the great heroes of this country in '63, '64 to being, at least among white Americans, fairly well hated. And it's interesting because his advisors were saying to him, stay in your lane. Some of his closest friends, most trusted assistants were saying, let's just stick to what we're good at. Let's stick to voting rights in the South. Let's stick to Jim Crow laws. And we know because exactly what King said, because we have the tapes, we have the FBI transcripts of his phone calls. And after his speech at Riverside Church in 1967, exactly a year before his assassination, in that speech, it was really a summary of all of his beliefs about how you can't just focus, you can't limit yourself to what's convenient. You have to fight for what you believe is right. And that means for him calling out injustice, calling out economic inequality, calling out police brutality, calling out the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, the United States government in Vietnam. And after that speech, which I consider his greatest speech, one of his best friends calls him, and we have the transcript of this phone call, and he says, Martin, I didn't like that speech. It's going to set us back. It's going to hurt our fundraising ability. It's going to hurt our relationship with the president if it's not already wrecked. And King says to his friend, it may have been politically unwise, but it was not morally unwise. And your heart breaks that he's having to explain himself to one of his closest friends. Don't you know who I am? Haven't you been listening to what I've been saying all this time? I'm a preacher. He's trying to save our soul, the country's soul. And it's just heartbreaking to see that he felt like no one was listening to him anymore.
Well, and obviously as you pointed out, it was a year before he was assassinated, and he's left a big legacy behind, the understatement of the year. But my question is, what is his legacy in Chicago? Certainly in the immediate aftermath, like in many cities, we had devastating rioting and property destruction, understandably so, in neighborhoods across the city. And we've had reporting in recent years just about how some of those neighborhoods don't look that much different. There hasn't been reinvestment, there hasn't been rebuilding. That's not universally true, but that is still true in some pockets of the city. What do you each see as being his legacy, particularly to Chicago?
Well, in the spirit of shouting out great journalism, several years ago, ProPublica Chicago did a story really busting this myth that the King riots devastated the West Side. And the story talked about all these things that we've talked about here on stage, the disinvestment, the white flight, with painstaking detail and document. So I think it becomes the shorthand of, well, the West Side got what it deserved. Why are they tearing up their own stuff? So I think that we have to, just like Jonathan is talking about reframing how we think about King collectively, I think we have to reframe even 1968 in our own city. You know, even though he wasn't successful here in Chicago, I still think it made a mark because we're talking about it today, and housing activists still talk about it. And then I guess the physical legacy that we see also would be Operation Breadbasket, which then became Operation Push, now the Rainbow Coalition, and what that has meant to Chicago over the past, 50 plus years.
I would just add that we have streets named after King, more than 1,000 across the United States, and on those streets, there's greater segregation, there's less investment economically than other streets in the city on average. So in some ways, we've celebrated him with the national holiday and the monument, things that he richly deserves, but we have not celebrated in the way he would have liked. And one example of that, Michelle Alexander writes about it in the new Jim Crow. She said when the riots erupted after King's assassination, we had an opportunity to respond by embracing the policies that he endorsed. Instead, we responded with police enforcement, with law enforcement, and we're still living with the effects of that today, too.
And our children get a really sanitized version of this in school.
Yes.
Every January and February.
And Natalie, I want to come back to what you pointed out about that there's misunderstanding about what happened. And one of the most moving parts of your book is talking about being a proud daughter of Chatham. Chatham and other neighborhoods get covered in ways that don't really reflect what the life in those communities. Tell us a little bit about your experience and also your perspective on coverage of the kinds of neighborhoods that Dr. King was up here to focus attention on.
There's a straight line of me being from the south side of Chicago, being from Chatham, and me being a journalist. And I mean, I was one of those, I guess, weird kids who knew very early, like since age 13, this is what I wanted to do, and did everything every summer to make that happen. And growing up, we got the Defender, we got the Sun-Times, we got the Tribune, and back then the Defender was daily. And I didn't, they were covering communities better. And I remember feeling, even as a kid, why does the news only cover violence in our neighborhoods? And I looked around, and I'm in a Girl Scout troop at my church, and my mother works at the public school 2 blocks away. All these things, Black-owned businesses, the legacy, Baldwin Ice Cream was there, Johnson Hair Care was there, Soft Sheen was down the street, Independence Bank, a Black bank that I still banked with when I was in college. So it was a much different upbringing than what was portrayed. So, I embrace my contradictions. Yes, I grew up in this amazing Black neighborhood, and then when I moved elsewhere, seeing other Black neighborhoods weren't as great. The disinvestment in Chatham, was really in home value. Not just the lack, maybe we didn't have as many amenities, but, the block clubs. And if you're ever on the south or west sides and you see those signs that say, welcome to the 8200 block of South King Drive, no loitering, no loud music, those signs don't exist anywhere else in the country but in Black neighborhoods in Chicago. And what that shows is the efficacy that neighbors feel, and that it isn't just about waiting on, and government created this mess, and government needs to have a response. But there's also, I don't think I've ever had a block club the way that I did when we were living in Chatham, and seeing, my father particularly involved with the block and with neighborhood associations.
So, closing question here, John, if there were a king-like figure in our country today, the broadly acknowledged civil rights leader of our country, and they were looking at Chicago as a place to come in order to make a point, what do you think, what might that issue or those issues be here in Chicago, and what might they say needs to be done about those issues?
Sadly,
Simple question,
I would
right?
say that they are far too similar to what King addressed and spoke about in 1966 when he came here. We're living in one of the most segregated cities in America with vast economic inequality, and these are exactly the issues that King called our attention to and exactly the issues he wanted to address on a nationwide scale when he tried to rally for what he called, the greatest campaign of his career, the Poor People's Campaign. It was basically going to be Occupy Washington, D.C., and he believed that there was never, especially after his experience in Chicago, nothing was going to change without fundamental economic reforms that had to come at a national level and had to really force us to re-examine some of the things we take for granted in our capitalist system. And I think he would be calling out the same exact issues because we're still haunted by them.
And I said final question, but actually your answer makes me think of a yet final question for the two of you, which is, how would that message be received today by the public and public officials? Are we in any better a place today than we were in the late 60s when these ideas were as radical as they seemed?
So Steve Bulgara, who used to work for the Chicago Reader, every 4 years used to write a column, "Why is no one in the mayoral race talking about segregation?" And there were a few other journalists who were, taking this on, understanding housing and education. And I remember being told by elected officials, it's not my job to fix, because again, it's seen as air and water, that it's a natural consequence instead of a man-made consequence. So I look at the difference between the 2015 and 2019 mayoral race. And just how people didn't talk about TIFs for years. Again, the Chicago Reader, Ben Drabowski, was writing about TIFs for so long, and then it got to a point maybe 20 years later that everybody who was running for office had to address TIFs. And there is a public understanding now of TIFs. And so between 2015 and 2019, even Gary McCarthy as a candidate was like, we have to address segregation. Now, whether every single candidate believed it, it was a much different discourse. And I attribute that to a lot of the journalism that was happening in town, as well as national conversations in journalism, because none of us are really taught this in school. I did a book report, a history fair project on white flight in 7th grade. It was terrible when I look back on it. It was just like white people lived here and now they didn't, because I didn't understand. So I think that, me talking about this on the BGA stage, would this have happened 30 years ago? I don't know. So I do think that there's a public understanding that has happened, and elected officials only do things when the public moves them to do it.
And I think that was part of King's power. He recognized that he had the ability to focus the news media on issues that they hadn't thought about or didn't want to think about for a long time. And when he came to places like Birmingham or Chicago, he was able to generate news and force us to confront some of the things that we'd been taking for granted for so long. And I think that we may not ever have another figure like King who can do that, but the news media can and must continue to do that, which is partly why we're all here today.
Right, and I think that's a fitting comment on which to end. I mean, that is why we're here. People who came here today came here to support this organization, but it's much bigger than that. People in this room are people who see the challenges that our city and state face, and instead of just being observers, want to do something about them. And so thank you for coming. Thank you for your support. Thank you to my colleagues at the BGA for the great work that you do day in and day out to advance some of the issues that we're talking about today. And let's keep these conversations going and try to take our city and state and country and, as Michael Sachs pointed out, our world to better places. Thanks very much.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Very well done.